Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the very first Emerging Market Insights Series talk, which is being co-sponsored by three organizations. The first is the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology Institute for Emerging Market Studies, which I direct. My name is Albert Park. I'm an economist in the Faculty of Economics and Social Science at HKUST. And the second organization, also at HKUST, is the Leadership and Public Policy Executive Education Program, directed by Angelina Yee, who will say a couple of words in a minute. And the third is EY, in particular EY Hong Kong. And Agnes Chan, the managing partner for Hong Kong, is also here and will say a couple of words of welcome. We're very fortunate to have a very distinguished speaker to kick off our series. We hope to do these on a semi-regular basis to try to provide thought leadership and insight on the critical issues facing businesses and policymakers in emerging markets. And that's the mission of our institute as well. We have at UST a very large group of about 40 faculty associates as well as postdoctoral fellows. And we do a large number of, we fund research projects and organize a number of events both on campus and off campus, and in collaboration with many partner research institutes around the globe. So we hope that you will follow our activities and events, and that you sign up, follow our social media pages, which is a good way to keep up with what we're doing. So I would like to welcome you to this inaugural collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Albert. As Albert said, I'm Angelina Yee. I'm with this new initiative at the University of Science and Technology, which is called the Leadership and Public Policy Executive Education Program. If you look among all the materials that we have passed to you, maybe too much, you'll see this folder, and inside you'll see a very brief introduction of what we do. And I hope you'll take a minute to leaf through it. And you'll see that we actually have a partnership with Oxford University, among others, to provide some executive workshops for people who are interested in issues that are vital to the public policy sector. Okay, so this is open enrollment. It is not restricted to any particular sector. Anyone can enroll for it. And we have a regular series now, and we already have had several programs in the past. The inaugural program was in January this year, and we had Vincent Lo, who's the sponsor of this program, give the inaugural keynote speech, and also the Vice Chancellor of Oxford University was here as well. So we have a series of themed seminars that focus on issues that are of timely concern to citizens in Hong Kong, and trying to provide a platform for understanding issues within the global context. So I invite you to take a look into this program and to enroll and participate in our programs. Our programs have been reviewed very favorably by all those who have participated. So without further ado, I invite Ms. Agnes Chan, Managing Director of EY Hong Kong, to give a few words. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Park, Professor Yee, Dr. Hartwell. Very welcome to the first Emerging Market Insight series, which we proudly take part in. And really great to see all of you here making your way despite the traffic interruption nearby. Geographic diversity is one of the significant features of EY as a truly globalized organization. And as an employer of over 29,000 staff based in Asia Pacific and over 200,000 staff based in 150 locations worldwide. We are committed to providing exceptional client services across various industries and disciplines, and also help our clients identify their growth opportunities in the fast-growing emerging markets. Our tagline, Building a Better Working World, also highlights our commitment to doing our part in building a better working world as a socially responsible organization. Over the past decades, there have been many changes within China as well as around the world. Emerging markets has become the future growth targets. The GDP growth in these markets will be 2.5 times faster than the developed markets. Capital and trade flows into and between these countries, these markets, will represent more than 60% of global economic activity. So their emergence is transforming the global economic relations, international politics, as well as business strategies of many multinational corporations. At EY, we recognize the importance of the emerging market. We also recognize that in order to succeed going forward, it is necessary to have the appropriate insights as well as understanding of these markets. Therefore, we have established IEMS, the Emerging Market Committee, to help our clients focus on their needs in these markets. We also have our EY Emerging Market Center of Excellence, which connects our clients to these rapidly growing economies. And to further support the work of our Emerging Market Center, EY has set up the IEMS, the Institute of Emerging Market Studies, in various locations. And we have collaborated with CIBS, the China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai, the India School of Business in India, and the Skopje in Russia. And we're also looking at other collaborations in Eastern Europe, Africa, South America, as well as the US. And of course, in Hong Kong, I promised Park to say that, this is the best collaboration in Hong Kong with the Hong Kong UST. We are pleased to work with Hong Kong UST and establishing IEMS. And the Institute will provide thought leadership and insights on key issues that will be affecting businesses and governments in the emerging market countries. We are very proud of this collaboration. And with no further ado, let me pass the stage to Dr. Hartwell, and I'm sure we all look forward to listening to how Russia will be impacting Europe, China, and the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't actually need this one. You want to do this? Yep. I've got my own. Okay. Great. Thank you. First off, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks to HKUST, to LAPP, and of course Ernst & Young for sponsoring my trip here. A little bit about me. I am familiar with both Ernst & Young and the IEMS brand. I moved to Poland in May after spending 2 years in Moscow with the Moscow School of Management, Skolkovo, and working with their brand of EAMS. I worked with the Beijing office for about 1.5 years prior to that as a part-time fellow. Now I'm the president of CASE, the Center for Social and Economic Research based in Poland. We were founded in 1991 by some of the leading lights of Poland's economic transformation. We really try to provide evidence-based policymaking, research to kind of feed into better policymaking for European integration and for our neighbors to the east, and while still keeping kind of a transition focus. Prior to this, I've been around the world. I was in South Pacific with the World Bank Group for about 3 years, worked with the US Treasury Department, so I've been everywhere. But really, I love Hong Kong, but my heart really is in Europe, which is why I wanted to talk today. And I'm happy that I was allowed to come here and talk to you about kind of as goes Europe, as goes Russia, so goes Europe. And really, the background behind this title, the talk itself, is what is happening now in Russia is what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening in Russia, does have implications for the global economy. And I think it's a very good example of, what we like to say, the butterfly effect, that a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world can start a tornado, a hurricane, elsewhere in the world. And I think what we're seeing happening right now in Ukraine has these global implications. So just to kind of give a quick overview of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the background, what the facts are. Familiar saying is, of course, that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not everyone's entitled to their own facts. then we can see how this kind of rolls out. What were the implications of Maidan, of the protests in Ukraine for the Ukrainian economy? Now, what does Ukraine mean for Russia? What are Ukraine and Russia and what is happening there now mean broader for Europe? And then what happens in Europe? How will it impact the rest of the world? So again, to kind of give a little bit of the background of the chronology of the crisis, Ukraine became independent on Christmas Day in 1991, and for the past 23 years has basically been a broken state. It's lurched from political crisis to political crisis. We saw the protests that led to the Orange Revolution in 2004, 2005, when there was accusations of Viktor Yanukovych stealing the election. The Orange Revolution forced Viktor Yushchenko into power, but there was a great letdown as Ukraine kind of devolved back into its petty squabbling, and there really wasn't much progress. So Viktor Yanukovych came back to power in 2010 and had been playing a dangerous game on both sides with Russia and with the European Union, promising that he would sign the EU association agreement at the Vilnius summit in November of last year, but then just days beforehand, backing out. Russia had already been exerting economic pressure. They had sanctions on Ukraine, reduced trade between the two countries by 25%, and an estimated cost to the Ukrainian economy of $15 billion in an economy that could not afford to lose $15 billion. Immediately after Yanukovych said that he was backing out of the EU association agreement, ordinary Ukrainians began to assemble on the Maidan Square. One thing that's very important to note here is that the EU association agreement was the spark, but the tinder and the firewood was already there. People weren't assembling in Maidan Square because they wanted the EU in Brussels to tell them what a banana should look like. They wanted to be felt as part of Europe, and they wanted, more importantly, to clean house of the corruption that had ruled in Ukraine for the past 23 years. So basically, this was the impetus to get people into the streets, but it took on its own character, and it really evolved into something much more important. There was an EU-brokered power-sharing agreement. The Polish foreign minister at the time, Radek Sikorski, helped to broker it, but it collapsed immediately as Yanukovych's security forces opened fire and 53 protesters were killed. Yanukovych fled the country that night, leaving the Rada, the democratically elected parliament, and by de facto, the Maidan coalition in charge of the country. So in February and March, kind of with this chaos going on in Kiev, using local proxies, Russia saw an opportunity, invaded and then annexed Crimea. Crimea is now shown on Russian maps as, of course, part of Russia. It's shown on many international maps as part of Russia. And so after this kind of unexpected success, Russia really attempted the same tactic in the Donbass region in March and April, but more openly as time went on. Now, you'll see in the news that there is a definite split between Western and Eastern Ukraine. It's not just ethnic or cultural, because most Ukrainians, all Ukrainians speak Russian. Many of them use it as their first language, even in the west of the country. But economically, there is a large split between those who orient themselves towards Russia, about the infrastructure that is oriented towards Russia, and the infrastructure that is oriented towards the West. So basically, we have this kind of proxy war going on in the east of Ukraine. It's being supported by some people in the east who are more culturally, ethnically Russian, but it's really being waged by proxies. The Ukrainians took a long time in all the political and economic disarray following Maidan to react to what was going on. But they started a counteroffensive in July. However, a Russian invasion in August, and I say here brazen, I'm an economist, this might not be the most polite of terms, but as someone who reads Russian and can see both of the Russian and Ukrainian press reports, there were tanks coming across the border. So this halted the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and we're kind of where we are now. It led to a stalemate. Of course, along the same time, eastern Ukraine is now occupied by Russian forces and Russian proxies, and some of whom have shot down a civilian airliner, Malaysian Airline 17, which of course there is an ongoing investigation. The Dutch authorities right now are looking into Moscow's claims that it was shot down by a Ukrainian fighter jet, but there seems to be a consensus coalescing that it was shot down by a surface-to-air missile. So in response to all of these events, the EU and the US have imposed sanctions on Russia, somewhat belatedly, somewhat haphazardly, and as I say here, with little thought of the goal. There really hasn't been stated what sanctions are supposed to achieve. Is it supposed to be Russia out of Crimea? Is it supposed to be Russia out of eastern Ukraine? Is it Russia rejoins the world community? What is really the end game here? And the US and the EU have given little thought to this goal. As an aside, part of that is probably because the EU and the US aren't as good as Russia at using trade for political gains. Russia has a long history of non-tariff barriers, sanitary and phytosanitary concerns that suddenly crop up in the midst of political issues. So where we are now, militarily, politically, economically, situation is in a stalemate. Ukraine now has a new president, and Petro Poroshenko. We also have a new parliament after the elections of October 26th. So the president has the second largest bloc. His prime minister has the largest bloc in the new Rada. And on the other half of the divide in Russia, President Putin enjoys record support. So we're not going anywhere anytime soon. Sanctions have escalated over the summer and the autumn, with the US and the EU, I say, working mostly in tandem. The US has generally been out front on this because of some issues within the European Union and the fact that the European Union is 28 different countries with their own political and economic agendas. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And of course, Russia retaliating. Russia has put on its own embargoes of meat, of food from the West writ large, also including Australia. And friends of mine in Moscow, who I keep in touch with at Skolkovo, say that there's a joke going around that President Obama was so happy when Putin decided to put up these sanctions because it showed that Putin was also joining the coalition of anti-Russian sanctions because they're really just hurting the Russian people. So the reality as it stands right now is that Russia's continuing invasion of Ukraine, it has economic consequences for Europe, of course for Asia, and for the world. First, let's start off with Ukraine. This kind of shows the breakdown, as I was talking before, of the percentage of the population that identified Russian as their native language. You can see there's a definite divide. Here is where most of the fighting is happening right now in Donetsk, but obviously Crimea always identified itself largely Russian, was given by Khrushchev in 1954 as a gift to Ukraine in one of the Soviet Union's more brazen territorial manipulations. And then here, Kiev, Chernobyl, Lviv is over here. So the West really does look West, and the East really does look East. Talk about how we arrived here. Like I said, Ukraine has seen 23 years of independence, but scarce growth. It wasn't until maybe the late 1990s that we actually got to see any positive growth. And then it was kind of wiped away fairly quickly in the global financial crisis. It's been a transition economy with a much slower, if at all, transition. When we look at the EBRD indicators, large-scale privatization, okay, it's moved a little bit. Sorry, if you're not familiar with the EBRD indicators, they are ranked from 1 to 4.33, 1 being no reform at all, 4.33 being basically convergence with Western European standards. It's a problem with EBRD's measurement system in saying that Western European standards are actually a transition, but it's supposed to imply kind of a convergence towards the West. Anyway, so large-scale privatization, Ukraine has moved far along, I would say, not as far as its compatriots even in Eastern Europe, but definitely not as far as the Central Eastern European and Baltic states. But it has moved along somewhat in large-scale privatization. It's moved further along in small-scale privatization, mainly because there's not a lot of money to be held in the smaller firms in the SME sector. Governance and enterprise restructuring in terms of corporate governance is still woefully lagging behind the rest of the transition space. It's probably on par with the rest of the CIS. And it's funny, here you can actually kind of see Ukraine's divide between West and East, in that in small-scale privatization and in large-scale privatization, somewhat it mimics towards the West. But when you look at governance, you know, it is looking more towards the East. It's more like the Commonwealth of Independent States. Price liberalization finally arrived after many kind of fits and starts under President Leonid Kuchma. And then we see kind of trade and foreign exchange has also gone up and mimics kind of Central and Eastern Europe. And then competition policy is, again, closer towards where you see it in points further east. But as I say here, reforms have been halting. They've really been subject to reversal. Major reforms didn't begin until 1994. There was, you know, coming from an institute in Poland, having worked with Leszek Balcerowicz, the architect of shock therapy in Poland, you know, one of the criticisms we often hear is that, especially in reference to Russia, is that it was all shock, no therapy, which of course isn't true. In Ukraine's case, however, it is a little more true because there was shock. There was price deliberalization, there was foreign exchange deliberalization immediately, and as can be expected, output plummeted and the populace was hurting during the transition. However, the reforms reversed almost immediately in 1992. So the major reforms had started, were stopped, started again in 1994. Kind of complex web of subsidies still in place to this day. Full price liberalization was not attained until 1997. This is after Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary had already returned to positive growth. Corruption in Ukraine is pervasive and it's legendary. It goes from the beat policeman all the way up to the president, as was seen on the morning of February 21st when the protesters entered the Mizhira residence outside of Kiev that Yanukovych had been living in. The tagline, the kind of the joke, is that the police aren't there to serve and protect, they're there to serve and collect. Political and economic institutional volatility have really hampered stable investment. So even after the policies were finally put in place, the institutions themselves weren't really allowed to grow. Property rights, in particular, have fluctuated wildly depending on who's in the presidential palace. The fact that getting ahead in terms of the political system became really about who you knew, as well as in the business realm, being about who you're connected with. It really hampered stable investment. There was no reason to go into Ukraine. As people say about Brazil, you know, Ukraine was the country of the future, and it would always be the country of the future. And the promise of the Orange Revolution, like I said, faded very quickly. And again, there was a clear economic divide between the Ukrainian-speaking Western, both in geography and attitudes, half of the country, and the Russian-speaking, aging, and dependent east of the country. And the aging bit we'll come back to in a minute. But I mean, the eastern regions, what we're talking about now, we say that Ukraine is losing the Donbass. You know, these are very, very old, very old industries. They're Soviet era. They're heavy industry. They are from the kind of the, for want of a better term, of the Soviet Union's great leap forward into industrialization, to kind of take it from an agrarian economy to an industrial. So these are the huge, labor-intensive, capital-intensive, inefficient industries, coal most of all, and of course it's been reliant on subsidies. So Ukraine was broken no matter how you look at it. I used to joke with my Russian colleagues that Russia and the EU should be fighting over who gets Ukraine, with the loser getting Ukraine rather than the winner. It has been broken for so long that it's tough to see it unbroken. There are really no bright spots for Ukraine in the short term as a result of Maidan, of course, as a result of the war. GDP is projected to contract at 9% in 2014. There's huge uncertainty in the East. Where does Ukraine end now? What is Novorossiya? What is Ukraine, and what does it mean to Ukrainians? So is this a frozen conflict? Again, I'm an economist, but there are some political, there's some political talk that President Putin wants to keep this state of affairs in the East as a frozen conflict, as we see in Georgia, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and also with Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, to kind of keep these countries from ever entering the European Union. Again, this is just some conjecture. The IMF has been in Ukraine to kind of rescue the economy, and now here I can comment a little more certainly as an economist. But I say this is more of the IMF's usual prescription. They obviously would like to slash some of the subsidies, but the IMF is really looking at the budget. This is what they are charged to do. This is what their mission is. They are looking at the budget in Ukraine and saying that we need to slash the subsidies, which are good, but we need higher taxes to fill the budget deficits. And I think that's the wrong remedy at this point. And basically, business as usual in Ukraine will not rescue the country. Again, to come back to Leszek Balcerowicz, he says that there's a time called extraordinary politics, where you have maybe 6 months, maybe a year, when a country can kind of coalesce around a crisis and you can get things done before it goes back to the normal haggling, the normal kind of trading, the normal political fighting. If Poroshenko and the Rada kind of continue or even just make tiny marginal changes to what's happened in Ukraine, Ukraine is going to continue to be a failure. There is no way around it. There is no way coming out of it. Business as usual will not rescue the country. So the long-term consequences, the old saying in English is the operation was a success, but the patient died. You can do everything technically correct, but still things may not go your way, especially if the patient was already very ill when they came in. So as I just said, the key for Ukraine's long-term prospects, it's radical and deep reform. Now, there's kind of this correlation and causation confusion. As people say, there are many sick people at the hospital, therefore going to the hospital makes you sick. If I avoid the hospital at all costs, I will not become sick. But just because you avoid the surgery doesn't mean you will survive. In fact, it's most likely the opposite. You still need the surgery. From there on, it becomes a game of chance, of circumstance, of how you progress. But you won't survive without the surgery. Even with the surgery, you might not survive. So Ukraine right now cannot survive without these kind of big bang reforms, with going further than Russia or the European Union, honestly, in terms of its liberalization, in terms of its business environment, in terms of cracking down on corruption. Only with the reform can the patient have a hope of survival. And Maidan and the war and having a new elected parliament really offers this opportunity. So it's up to the Ukrainians to kind of seize it. These are the things that they can do endogenously that aren't necessarily dependent on these exogenous factors. As an example of a needed reform, Ukraine's trading system is corrupt and overtly bureaucratic. I wrote in the Wall Street Journal Europe a couple of weeks ago about this, that you look at the trading across borders from the World Bank doing business, the distance to the frontier, with 100% being the frontier. Starting from 2006, there were still 70% of the world's countries were better than Ukraine in ease of trading across borders, in ease of import, export, time, cost for containers, number of documents you have to do. We're still at 53% in the latest doing business for 2015. So there's still 47% of the world is better than Ukraine. This is something that can be eliminated fairly easily in terms of cleaning up the customs administration, reducing the number of stamps, notarizations, signatures, reducing the number of paperwork to import and export. These are things that will also reduce the kind of rent-seeking that comes with customs administration in Ukraine. And like I said, freeing trade will help tame corruption and will also orient away from Russia and towards the West. So now let's go to Russia, my former home. For 2 years, I was a Russian taxpayer. So I like to throw that out there, especially if anyone claims me of being anti-Russian, or as they do on Twitter, accuse me of being a Nazi, which is quite interesting, given that I live in Poland, and that's not really something we take lightly. But anyway, pre-Maidan, Russia's economy was already slowing down. GDP growth, obviously Russia took a big hit during the global financial crisis, as everyone did. But you see, they rebounded fairly strongly. This is quarterly growth going back to 2007. If I had pulled it back, you would have seen kind of the same business cycle, but you see a downward trend. We have this growth, then we have a huge slump, and then the recovery is starting to taper off already, well before anything happens in Ukraine. As I say, it was Russia's inevitable slowdown. The Russian economy pre-Maidan was characterized by lack of investment. We had an investment to GDP ratio of about 26% in 2013. In China, we have 47%. In all emerging markets, you have about 32.2%. This is up from a high during the global financial crisis of just 13%. So there isn't investment in the Russian economy. And most importantly, what kind of investment are you looking at in Russia? You're looking by the state, and you're looking at mega projects, such as the Sochi Olympics or the APEC summit in Vladivostok. So these were large, multi-billion-dollar U.S. investments that were really directed and in some way kind of politically chosen. Of course, Russia, the biggest knock on Russia is its concentration in commodity exports. 68% of its total export revenue comes from oil and natural gas. It is heavily reliant on things that come out of the ground and processing things that come out of the ground. And it's only gotten worse over the past 8 years. And of course, there's kind of a creeping re-bureaucratization of the economy. And it really started once Medvedev handed over back to Putin. It's been bad overall for the business environment. I say that some gains have been made in the World Bank doing business indicators, especially this year. It's really been driven by Moscow. There have been some reforms that originated in the mayor's office in Moscow that have really kind of simplified and streamlined. But if you get outside of Moscow, the level of English is low, the level of bureaucracy and mistrust of foreigners is very high. And there's been a kind of this, it's the reverse sense of what you would find in Hong Kong or what you would find in the United States and maybe in Great Britain as well, is that you need permission to do anything. Things that are not permitted explicitly are forbidden. And that's kind of the mindset that you have when it comes to business. And that kind of stifles innovation and entrepreneurship. So it's a Russia plus invasion equals stagnation. And since Yanukovych, who is actually in Russia right now, we've seen record capital outflows, ruble depreciation beyond the capacity of the Central Bank of Russia to manage. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think the Central Bank of Russia has been one of the bright spots in Russia's economic management. Price inflation, especially since the sanctions have started to kick in, and capital markets have really been in headlong retreat. So I said what was a downward trend is now a plummet. It's something that didn't have to happen, but has now been kind of aided by events. Running for the exits. Obviously, inflows, outflows of capital by the private sector in Russia had a big rebound in June when it looked like there was going to be some sort of peace, especially once ironically, once the Ukrainian government started making gains again in the east. But prior to that, with Crimea, with the original kind of incursion in the Donbass, just huge capital outflows. One of the things that we talked about when I was with IEMS in Moscow is that Moscow wants to be seen as an international financial center. It wants to be a Hong Kong. It wants to be a Dubai. It wants to be a London. Unfortunately, there are many problems. There were many problems with this beforehand, one of which obviously being the ruble. Very difficult. While it is fully convertible, it's nowhere near a reserve currency. But the biggest problem is that Russian investors don't want to keep their money in Russia. Why would other investors want to keep their money in Russia? They go through Cyprus, they go through Ukraine, and then they come back. The flows going in and out are staggering, actually, as they are here. And a lot of this is not kind of Western investors that are leaving, because a lot of the Western investors were already pulling back. Larger banks were already pulling back. The financial sector was becoming much more concentrated from about 2010, 2009 to 2014 already. A lot of this is Russians just kind of leaving for good. their money is in London, their money is in Hong Kong, their money is in Dubai, and it's not going back to Russia anytime soon. Ruble volatility. The ruble has always been an unstable currency. Looking at kind of just the log squared of changes from day to day. We had huge spikes during the global financial crisis, but the ruble's always been very volatile. We're not seeing the huge spikes over here when we're talking about Crimea, when we're talking about the invasion of Ukraine. Look at it another way, kind of the absolute changes in the US dollar-ruble exchange rate. Again, this is kind of, we've seen this before. And again, this is where we say there could be difficulties in Russia being a great financial player because the ruble does have more volatile swings than you would see with the US dollar, with the euro, with the yen. But since the invasion, we've seen a lot more volatility kind of on an upward trend. But when we talk about the volatility, when we talk about the level of the ruble has deteriorated rapidly. We've seen since August, the ruble has really accelerated its plummet. Now this is kind of interesting because we saw, well, I was paid in rubles when I lived in Russia, so I was very cognizant of the exchange rate. My original contract was denominated at 30 rubles to the dollar. I think it was at an all-time high when I started in Moscow. And by the time I left, it was, I think, 35 to the dollar. That slide from 30 to 35 really reflected Ukraine-specific risk, sanction-specific risk. Since August now, the ruble's probably at about, it broke 42 the other day. I'm not sure what it is right now. But we're seeing oil prices decline. And this is really, really hitting at the US dollar ruble exchange rate. It's been taking this meandering walk up levels at the exact same time that oil prices have been coming down. So this kind of latest volatility reflects, this latest level really reflects on the structure of the Russian economy. Also, as friends of mine from the IMF in Russia point out, Russia has a lot of external obligations that are due in December. They are dollar denominated. The markets know this as well. So there is real concern, not necessarily about Russia's ability to pay, because they still have many billions of dollars of reserves, but about how this will affect the next tranche after that. Inflation, as I said, price inflation was always an issue in Russia, but it's really begun to accelerate. And this is where you can really see kind of the changes that have come about because of sanctions, because of Crimea. Probably in the 6% range up until March, and then 7, 8, 11%. Price inflation in food has begun to skyrocket at the same time that food is disappearing from the shelves. It's not the Soviet era. It's not going to be meat queues. But still, as I said before, Russia has kind of shot itself in the foot here by prohibiting the import of foods. We see this kind of price inflation. And finally, kind of capital markets are in retreat. Moscow Stock Exchange has really seen a roller coaster of a ride since Crimea. Huge plummet. I went on RT the day of the huge drop depicted here that kind of came about with Crimea, and there was great worry about this kind of becoming another financial crisis. Again, it's kind of a slow-moving financial crisis because everyone's waiting to see what happens in eastern Ukraine. But I was asked, if I thought this was going to become a global financial crisis. And well, being on RT, I had to be diplomatic and say that I don't think so. It's not really, it's something that can happen. They had a bigger drop during the global financial crisis. But again, to be frank, Russia doesn't influence the world economy as much as perhaps the people at RT think that it does. The Russian financial markets, the whole financial sector, is about the size of Ireland in terms of turnover. It's about $19 trillion. So it's not really a large player, but it does hurt businesses, small, medium enterprises especially, in Russia that can't access this capital. There's been such a loss, and there was kind of this recovery during the time where we felt that maybe we were going to have some stability, some kind of resolution of what was happening in eastern Ukraine. But again, it's kind of bottomed out. So some conclusions on Russia. It was already in a precarious position, but it was manageable. It could have been surmounted. Some of the issues that were in Russia before Maidan are still there. There's need for structural reform. There is need for diversification of the economy. There is need for debureaucratization. Kazakhstan eliminated the notarization requirement. If you've ever been in Russia, you need a notary for everything. When I was leaving Russia, I had to go to a notary. I needed to have a translator. I needed to have a translator who had her own translator's certificate, which was notarized, to show that she could confidently translate from Russian to English for me legally, and then that had to be notarized again. Yes, you eliminate that, you eliminate so much time out of the economy. So Russia's problems were manageable. They could have been surmounted. P.J. O'Rourke said, he's the American humorist of Irish descent, said that Russia is so frustrating for Americans because we want to go there, we want to roll up our sleeves, we want to take out the cleaning, we want to take out the sponge, and we're like, we'll have this place working in 2 weeks. But we never do. And that's the problem with Russia, is that it has manageable problems. It doesn't have the weight of the world on its shoulders. Spanning 11 time zones, having 20% of the world's forestry resources, being the world's largest producer of oil, it has manageable problems. And so the invasion of Ukraine is really having a major negative effect on the economy. I said we haven't even spoken about the fiscal effects. I mentioned earlier that eastern Ukraine is old. Not only is the industry old, but the population is old. Crimea subsisted mainly on transfers from the federal government in Kiev at that point. They have the highest proportion of pensioners in all of Ukraine, now one of the highest proportion of pensioners in Russia. And Russia is already an aging economy. They've really kind of pulled this huge fiscal liability at the same time when oil prices are plummeting. I think the most recent break-even point for oil prices in Russia was $120 a barrel, which we're not at anymore, meaning that unless the oil price goes up above US 120, the budget in Russia will not be in balance. There will be a deficit. And that price has been climbing. It used to be $85, then it was $95. So there really is kind of this government overspending, and at the exact same time, they incur this huge fiscal liability. And as I say here, and this is something I'll talk about in a few minutes, about sanctions, is we're talking about economic issues to what is a political problem. And the only way for Russia to really get out of this suboptimal path is apparently politically infeasible at this point in time. If 88% of the Russian people support President Putin, depending on what poll you look at, why would you give that up now? You can ride out this storm. You can hold on a little bit longer. Now, to come to kind of Europe and Asia, how this turmoil is rolling out around the world, this came at a really bad time for Europe. Not that war ever comes at a good time, but the Eurozone is really still struggling with its own issues. Obviously, the Eurozone crisis has been a sovereign debt crisis, and it's not over. It's gotten better, but I say here, what austerity? There's a big talk in Europe of has the austerity measures that accompanied this kind of nascent recovery coming out of the euro crisis. Was this austerity go too far? Slashing government spending, slashing health, welfare spending. Well, first off, where's the austerity? The Eurozone 18 government expenditure hit a high of 22.3% of GDP in 2008. Then in 2009, after a global financial crisis wiped out trillions of dollars worth of wealth, it came down to a whopping 22%. And it's been hovering at 21.5, 21.5, and it's actually gone up in 2013 to 21.6% of GDP. Again, this is across all Eurozone 18. So there have obviously been some changes within specific countries, but on the whole, there hasn't been austerity. The governments are still spending like it's 2007. Overall, the EU's growth is, as I say here, anemic. They hope to see 1.5% growth in GDP across the entire EU, not just the Eurozone, the EU 28, and very optimistically, 2% in 2015. But unemployment is still a problem. I think this kind of comes back to Europe's own structural issues, but especially youth unemployment, which is skyrocketing in the southern countries. Italy, Spain, Greece see youth unemployment rates probably around 40%. So really, what you're looking at now is a fragile European recovery. Granted, these are more resilient economies. They have broader markets. They have more experience in this issue. They obviously have the European Central Bank, which hasn't gone as far as the U.S. Federal Reserve in terms of its stimulus programs. But they are, of course, still close to the zero-bound interest rate. So the EU is fragile still. And so anything that really increases instability on its borders and can force greater spending on defense could be a major blow to these struggling economies. One of the things that we like to talk about in the United States is kind of how Europe benefits from the U.S. defense umbrella. Now, obviously, the U.S. has been cutting its military spending. We've been pulling troops out of Western Europe, although they've kind of gone back into the Baltic states and Poland with Ukraine. But Europe really doesn't spend a lot on its own defense. It really kind of relies still, I would say, on the United States. If France, if Germany, and especially if the Baltic states or Poland have to devote more of their precious resources to greater spending on defense, this too could be a major blow for their struggling economies. Fiscally, they're already kind of strapped, so this will really hurt in the long run. So to kind of narrow it down to Central and Eastern Europe, just want to let you know, if you see Polish apples, you should definitely go out, buy them, and eat them. They are very delicious. But just bordering Ukraine and this whole kind of crisis is having a deleterious effect in Central and Eastern Europe. Obviously, there's a lot of economic research that shows kind of thy neighbor's curse. Chua and Addis from Yale in 1997 kind of showed how regional instability hits countries that are adjoining that region. But the growth estimates for the Central European, Southeast European region have been revised downward to 1.2%. The largest slowdowns have really been in Southeastern Europe. But the Baltics are still doing fairly well. They're doing great, actually, as could be better than expected with this kind of threat looming over their head. Obviously, Russia has been making, I don't want to say threats, but has raised concerns about Russian minorities in Estonia and in Latvia. But the Baltics really came out of the global financial crisis fairly strong. They did the structural reforms that were necessary, and they're still projected to see robust growth above EU averages. Poland, where I live, the agricultural exports are suffering. And the Baltic states as a whole are really heavily reliant on agricultural imports from Russia. These countries, perhaps ironically, perhaps paradoxically, are also the ones pushing for harder and more stringent sanctions on Russia. The ones that are going to be hurt the most are the ones that are really pushing for more punishment. So again, you can see there's a huge political element to the sanctions, to the posturing that kind of is coming around the invasion. But on the whole, financial and trade links have been moving away from Russia for the past 20 years. They were never as solid. They were never as interconnected as Ukraine, which obviously was part of the Soviet Union. Poland, Czech Republic especially, the Baltics were also part of the Soviet Union, but they were culturally distinct, very resistant, and undertook even more radical reforms, especially Estonia, at the beginning of transition, to kind of sever links with Russia, apart from kind of the agricultural side and energy, which we'll talk about in a second. And the real problem is in Central and Eastern Europe, and in Europe as a whole, is that markets are like agriculture. They are organic in that they take time to grow. They take time to nurture. A business needs to find clients. It needs to find customers. And once you sever those links, it takes a long time for these new shoots to grow in a different direction. I think that's really one of the difficulties that is facing, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. But the biggest implication for Europe, as I said, is energy. Natural gas import dependency on Russia in Eastern Europe is huge. Slightly less huge in Germany and France, but it's still there. And this has really been what's been driving the wedge in terms of the EU's approach towards Russia. There have been some moves towards energy independence. Unfortunately, the EU's solution has just been kind of uniform pricing of gas. They feel that Russia has been manipulating the price for different countries for political gain, which may be true, but uniform pricing I don't think is the solution. Lithuania has been more proactive, has created a liquid natural gas container port, and is really looking to kind of import from the United States. It'll take a long time for that to become online, to become economically viable. So really, when it comes to energy, this is the biggest implication. And anything that can threaten Europe's energy supply is what is going to harm Europe. So kind of finally, talking about Ukraine and its implications for Asia. Surprisingly, Asia may benefit from the turmoil in the West. Russia is now looking east. There has been a lot of talk, and I've done work on the Eurasian Union. Right now, the customs union of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia, and it's looking to expand. Kyrgyzstan and Armenia are kind of associate members, and there's possibility Tajikistan may join. So Russia is kind of had it with the West. It's looking for emerging markets. It's looking towards the east. So perhaps there will be a diversion of trade away from Europe and an opportunity for Chinese investors and manufacturers. Like I said, it'll take time for the shoots to grow in this direction where they formerly grew this way, but it's a possibility. As I said, sanctions might also accelerate the move east, and this has ramifications for Central Asia, which is already somewhat dependent on China, especially Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is actually having a bad deal in the Eurasian Customs Union because some of the tenets that have been dictated from Moscow are really preventing Kazakhstan from utilizing Chinese labor, from benefiting from its long border with Western China. And the Russian government is already trying to place more emphasis on the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So if we're focusing on kind of the BRICS countries, perhaps this can highlight China's economic power on the world stage more. But in reality, I would say the costs of Ukraine seem to really far outweigh the gains. The big one is, of course, that Russia's invasion threatens Europe's fragile economy recovery. As I said before, China and Europe trade over €1 billion a day. If Europe continues to slump at a time when China is really worried about its own growth slowdown, this is a significant threat. Global instability in general is an unmitigated negative. Again, China, facing its own slowdown, cannot afford to have international investors nervous. Why would you want, in an environment where quantitative easing is pulling back, but where there's still structural unemployment, where there's still issues where you can't really get returns anywhere else in the world, why would you want to scare off the investors that would be coming your way anyway, just because of something that's happening thousands of miles away? And then finally, I think China's trade with Russia may already be near its maximum potential. China and Russia do not have a lot of complementarities in terms of trade, mainly because Russia doesn't produce as much outside of oil, natural gas, and extractive industries. Given the way the structure of the economies are now, China would still be trading much with Russia, but Chinese gains from increases in Russia and Russia looking east are I think would be negligible. We're already near maximum potential. So finally, to conclude, the European economy remains fragile, and continued instability in Ukraine, it's bad for the world. It's bad for Russia, obviously. It's bad for Ukraine, obviously. Europe is still fragile. And Asia, while it might see more benefits than most, it's still kind of threatened by these follow-on effects. It's a cascade that is just kind of working its way around the world. Economic sanctions and solutions cannot hope to solve what is a political problem. Again, I said at the beginning that the EU and the US, they don't really know what these economic sanctions, what they're supposed to do, what is the end game. Russia has shown great resilience in the past in terms of waiting out sanctions, in terms of waiting out economic warfare. I made this point in a radio interview, I think with Voice of Russia, where I said that if it comes down to a trade war between US, EU, and Russia, Russia's going to win because Russia knows how to use trade as a weapon. The US and the EU are neophytes at it. They're very immature at it. Russia will take the pain. Russia will wait out. They went for 70 years without having Australian steak. They can do it again. The instability ailing Ukraine and Russia can be hugely mitigated if Russia would play a constructive role. I say constructive role. My own personal feeling, obviously, is that Russia should pull out of Ukraine. Russia has its own economic and geopolitical interests in Ukraine. But as I advised when I was working at the Moscow School of Management, is that Russia benefits from a strong Ukraine. Russia has not benefited from having this swamp of corruption on its western borders. Russia needs Ukraine to be good, and Ukraine could play that role as facilitator from the European Union to Russia and back. Russia should really want to have a strong Ukraine, not a fragile Ukraine. But until Russia kind of wakes up to this realization, Europe is going to be hampered by instability, as I think, unfortunately, for this year, for next year, until we have some resolution, as will Asia. So, thank you very much. Any questions?
So we have some time for questions from the audience. Why don't we take a few questions, and then we'll bring it back to Chris.
Excellent talk. Thanks very much, Chris. One disconnect that I haven't resolved, perhaps you can, is why Putin is so popular in the face of the economic harm that Russia is suffering through and is likely to suffer more of.
Okay.
Maybe you can identify yourself and where you're from.
Hi. Hello, I'm CM Yan. I'm a local finance and real estate developer. Now, a lot of people are thinking that Putin is actually coming back from and trying to exert his power on all his former Soviet Union blocs.
Mm-hmm.
And how likely do you think this is the case? And if that happens, so what's going to affect Europe, Russia, and Asia?
Yeah. Okay. We'll start off with the disconnect between Putin's popularity. I agree. It's kind of fascinating to me to see. I think the key thing here is who is going to be harmed by the sanctions. Right now, we've had these kind of targeted sanctions that say we're going to hit the richest people in Russia. The richest people in Russia aren't. They're going to find ways to get Italian wine. They're going to find the way to get French foie gras. this isn't really going to begin to hurt them. Closing capital markets, maybe pulling Russia off of kind of the SWIFT payment system, that might hurt some of the richest people. Right now, and I said kind of culturally, Russians have a great magnitude for suffering. In fact, in Orthodox religion, it's kind of a boon. Suffering leads to a great afterlife. So the more suffering you have now is actually better. Putin is seen right now and kind of in the immediate aftermath of Crimea as having restored, quote-unquote, Russia's greatness that was, quote-unquote, lost when the Soviet Union fell. So it's really kind of an evanescent effect right now. It's kind of national pride, which is fine. You have national pride. That's great. I love the United States. I love Poland. You can love Russia. It's just, as time goes on, I think you're going to see that wear away. Also, the kind of consolidation of media in Russia has really contributed to this effect, so that the sources of independent information are really starting to kind of winnow down. So again, as I said, I was on RT, and the first thing that was asked of me off camera was, did you hear what they're doing to Russians in East Ukraine? Isn't it terrible? And I was like, I think there's a little bit worse things to be worrying about right now. But anyway, so sources of information, I would say, are nowhere near what they would be in Hong Kong, in the United States, elsewhere in Europe. So the question about Putin kind of exercising his influence in the former Soviet sphere, obviously. Armenia is the prime example of that. Armenia was also on its way to signing the Europe Association Agreement. I lived in Armenia for 2 years on a USAID project. Armenia, frankly speaking, is never going to be in the EU. It's never going to be part of Europe. But it would have been nice for it to kind of garner some of the benefits of liberalization that came with the EU Association Agreement. But Armenia has its own internal political worries. Number one being Nagorno-Karabakh, kind of the exclave. So, and Russia's the only country that can guarantee that Nagorno-Karabakh remains independent and isn't swallowed up again by Azerbaijan. And I wasn't privy to any of these conversations, but I believe in my heart that Armenia switched because Putin gave an explicit guarantee. Kyrgyzstan was already kind of blowing in the wind when they went through 2 separate revolutions. Now they have Atambayev, who campaigned as mildly pro-Russian. Now Kyrgyzstan wants to join the customs union. I think those are probably the only ones you'll see flip. Azerbaijan has no desire. They have their own oil wealth. Georgia is, parts of it are still occupied by the Russians. Uzbekistan has blatantly, repeatedly and directly said no to the customs union. Tajikistan might join. That wouldn't benefit anyone. It wouldn't benefit Tajikistan. It wouldn't benefit Russia. But other than that, I mean, this is obviously kind of a power play to pull back some of the things that were lost, especially with the U.S. Intervention in Afghanistan, the use of Manas Air Base in Kyrgyzstan, the use of in Tashkent. So this is a way politically for him to kind of exert his influence. Economically, I don't know if the influence ever really went away. The infrastructure is all still oriented towards the north and Central Asia. Obviously, China's making great inroads in Central Asia, and I think it would be difficult, or maybe not difficult, I think it would be a shame for some of the countries, like Kyrgyzstan especially, which could really benefit from cross-border trade with China, with joining the customs union instead. So I think, yeah, it is. It's not a blatant, reconstituting the Soviet Union, but it is trying to extend the sphere of influence.
Thank you, Christopher, for the wonderful presentation. So just now you were talking about that Russia will be staying away from the West and coming to the East. So question number one, what would this have, the impact on Hong Kong? Would this bring benefits to Hong Kong? This is question number one. Mm-hmm. Question number two, it seems that Russia is quite mysterious, to a lot of people, including me. For example, can you quote a few reputable companies from Hong Kong that are having presence in Russia already, so that this perhaps can give us, people in Hong Kong a little bit of indication how Russia is also, promoting itself, to people in Hong Kong, because during your presentation you have only talking about Russia, China, but Hong Kong is a gateway to China. Okay,
Right.
so two more sideline questions. For a country, to get stronger and stronger from obscurity, to prominence, I always believe that, the rule of law, and a good tax system would be beneficial, to the country. So how would you comment on the tax system in Russia right now, as well as the rule of law in in Russia right now? Thanks very much.
Okay, I'll start with the last ones. Tax system is actually very good in Russia. They went to a flat tax maybe 10 years ago, 11 years ago now. Simplified the loopholes, so at least on paper, the Russian tax system is very favorable. I would say it's also favorable for foreign corporates. It comes down to kind of the implementation, the administration, what you need, how many lines you have to stand in, and so forth. So paying taxes is actually fairly easy in terms of policy. Tax administration is difficult in Russia. In terms of kind of Russia's interest in Hong Kong, I don't think there actually is a lot of interest for Russia in Hong Kong. First off, Russia talks about China because they like to. Putin is not an economist. Economics really tends to bore Putin. He likes it when it's kind of, again, the mega projects and things like that can point towards Russia's national greatness. The economics team, and I mentioned this in passing, like the Central Bank of Russia or the Ministry of Finance, Ministry for Economy and Development, are very good, I would say, in Russia. But they have to deal with what is being handed to them. They would probably love to see kind of the cross-border trade, more involvement in Hong Kong. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but I think in terms of the way that the Russian economy is going now, Hong Kong doesn't offer the same opportunities. It doesn't have the same cachet that China does. It's 1.5 billion people now. This whole new market that we can use to supplant what we used to have in the West. And you mentioned rule of law, and I think that also presents a problem for Putin to kind of come to Hong Kong, which is the #1 most economically free country in the world, and to say, we trade with Hong Kong is going to be great for us, but we still need to be economically less free. How do you justify that? You say Hong Kong is done fantastically, and it's at the top of all these rankings, doing business, economic freedom of the world. How do you justify keeping your own protection? How do you justify these kind of policies when you're working with Hong Kong? So I think they're really thinking larger is kind of the problem. In terms of simplifying Russia for Hong Kong businesses, I honestly don't know of any Hong Kong businesses that are operating. We see some of the larger Chinese banks, maybe some construction, but again, Russia's economy has become more Russian in the past 4 years.
Hi, David Nesbitt, Eastwind Capital. My question is simply on Putin himself. And my vision is of him half naked on horseback, and then somebody puts ex-KGB. It's interesting, his public brand and his persona. One is, why does he do what we would call the bizarre pictorial effects? Two is, why is he seen on the global stage as what's the word, aggressive?
Well, I think one feeds into the other. I think seeing him on, shirtless on horseback, he likes to present that macho image. I think it resonates well with, Russia isn't Moscow, St. Petersburg, Vladivostok, and maybe Nizhny Novgorod. You know, it's 11 time zones, although by fiat it's no longer, I think it's only 9 time zones. It spans so much of the world. There's just, it's still so agrarian and village-centric and I would say provincial in parts, especially, where there's just not this contact with the outside world, that he plays well to a traditional cultural mentality of the men are strong, the women are stronger but don't appear as such, and that really resonates. I think, I would say after living there for 2 years and having been in the former Soviet Union for the past 15 plus years, is that, you know, he seems aggressive, part of it because he is aggressive. Obviously, the opportunities afforded to him in Crimea and Ukraine, he sees with both hands. Culturally, also, there's a little bit of a difference in that Russians are much more straightforward. They'll tell you, I'm originally from New York, so I understand when walking down the streets of Moscow, if they don't like you, they tell you that they don't like you. You understand the feeling. They're much more direct. Those in the West would find them rude and have found them rude. And I think his approach to diplomacy is in that kind of line of great Russian statesmen and is very direct. I think the other reason, and I didn't mention it here, is that every time Russia experiences an economic slowdown, it's very, very dangerous to be anywhere near Russia. Because in 1999-2000, they invaded Chechnya. In 2008, the global financial crisis, they invaded Georgia. In 2013, slowdown, they invaded Ukraine. It's very dangerous to be near Russia. And they have, I would say, a justifiable reputation as being aggressive because it happens on economic slowdowns like clockwork.
Herman Chan, ex-Hong Kong U staff. My question is that the big China agricultural companies are signing contract with Russia for bulk supply of vegetable and grocery. Mm-hmm. Does it offset the trade embargo from Europe on agricultural product? And Russia could get away with this, with China supply?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know about the volumes going from China to Russia. It would be interesting. I think one of the problems here is the fact that Russia is still kind of reliant on, you know, kind of external suppliers for agriculture. Again, having such a huge territory. Granted, you know, the amount of arable land in that territory is minuscule, and that's one of the reasons actually people say that Ukraine is so important. It's the breadbasket of Europe. Although Ukrainian agricultural production has stagnated over the past 23 years because it's been seen as a source of rents. I think that there might be, like I said, there might be some scope for China to make up the difference. I don't know if it can do the entire diversity that kind of the nouveau riche Russians have come to understand. You know, a lot has been placed. It's not only economically looking at these mega projects, but a lot of emphasis has been placed on the way you look. It's kind of status for show. I've never seen so many Bentleys and Maseratis and Lamborghinis as I have in Moscow. And it's very trying to project itself as an affluent society. There is still kind of a bias against Chinese goods. They're seen as cheaper or whatever. I don't know how that will play out in the longer run. I don't know if it would be able to kind of fill the gap.
One supplement on this is China agricultural companies are also signing huge growing contract in Western Ukraine.
Really?
Yeah, they are signing huge areas of production for 5-10 years, and they're sending a lot of China labor there.
That's excellent. That's what Ukraine needs. Ukraine needs that investment. Unfortunately, there's been a moratorium on land sales for almost the entire time Ukraine has been in existence, because this is the worry that's in eastern Ukraine, is that they think the Chinese and the Arabs, and this is a direct quote, are going to come in and buy our land. So it's actually kind of funny that the Chinese are working in western Ukraine. I doubt the Arabs will be moving in anytime soon.
Well, if the Russians want to buy brand name products, they can certainly come to Hong Kong.
Yes.
we're at our time, so I want to thank you for your patience and staying really past time. And I definitely want to thank our speaker, Chris Hartwell, for the very illuminating talk today. Thank you very much for coming.